Hello, my name is Janet Kroon, and this is the book that I edited, the Civil War Diaries of Laroy Gresham. It's called The War Outside My Window. It's a book written by a young man who lived in Macon, Georgia during the Civil War while he was also fighting a terminal illness. But it's a fascinating look at social history in the era. He follows all of the war action as it goes, and so you get a really good glimpse into what it was like to be living in the South during the Civil War. You can get this book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and from the publisher, Savas.
Okay, again, you are speaking tonight at...
You can cut that. Tonight I'm speaking at the Civil War Roundtable in Milwaukee, and I'm thrilled to be here.
You can hear me, right? Yes, you can. Well, I've waited a long time for this. I have. If you remember last year, I stood up here and for the very first time in years, I said, go out and buy this book. So if you haven't gotten it, you better pick up a copy tonight. Jan Kroon, who we've become friends with, holds a bachelor's degree in political science, modern European history, and Russian language and area studies. She also has a master's degree in international studies, and she has taught international baccalaureate history for nearly 2 decades. And developed a deep interest in the Civil War when, do you still live in Virginia?
I still do.
Still lives in Virginia, which is how she developed this. Now, Jan sent my buddy Ted Savas, who you know I love, a link back. And it was to an article written about the diaries that you're going to hear about today. Well, Ted pursued it and found out that these diaries, which are in the Library of Congress, had never been published. And that's the end of the story there with Ted. You know, he's going to make sure he had it done. And Jan went and did the research on it, took the diaries, edited them. The footnotes alone in the book, too, are worth reading, and you better. The third printing of this book has now sold out, and it'll be going into its 4th printing. So I think that says something by its own. And I think this really sums it up best. Gary Gallagher, in his review of the book, said, "The War Outside My Window is a remarkable diary that illuminates important aspects of mid-century American life. Kept by a Georgia teenager coping with a fatal disease, he had spinal tuberculosis. It affords modern readers the best record I have encountered of the daily suffering and treatment of a terminally ill person during the Civil War era. Beyond the rich evidence relating to Laroy Gresham's illness and Victorian medicine, it includes a bountiful array of observations about military, political, and social elements of the Civil War as witnessed from the Confederate home front. Alternately instructive, moving, and disturbing, the diary deserves a wide audience. This book is about a young man who really looked at the war outside his window. It's his social history of that time period, it's a political history, it's a military history, it's what he saw. And he's such a clever young man. He really is. The diary needs to be read and ingested. You need to take it slowly and enjoy what you're reading and understand what you're reading. And I can't tell you how happy I am that we have Jan Kroon with us tonight. So please join with me and give a very, very warm Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable welcome to Janet Kroon.
Thank you. Thank you, and I am thrilled to be here tonight. Ted, I spoke with earlier today, Ted Savas. He says he knows many of you personally, and he says, go Vikings. So Done my job. I won't tell you I'm a Cub fan. This has been a remarkable journey for me. I was going through some medical issues and was at home and starting to get bored. Like I said, I was missing my students. Once I got asked how many kids I had, and I said 134. I only have 2 personal children. But this fell into my lap almost literally. And I'll tell you that whole story when we get to it in the slides. But it's been a remarkable journey. I get to go to places like this, speak with different groups who are interested in this time period, which, as she read to you, didn't include Civil War history for me academically, but I've fallen in love with the area, living in Mosby's Confederacy, as I do. This is the only image that we have of Laroy. Who knows, one may turn up, another one, but we think he's about 10 years old at this point. And a very attractive young man, and there's a screenshot of the journals, some of the pages, and it was easy to work with. I've worked with student handwriting for years, and his was a delight to read. And is another example of why I am in favor of cursive in schools. The kids would miss this. And there are examples of his handwriting in the book. He was a bright young man. He's funny. He has a great intellect for somebody so young. And as my younger daughter says, he's the 3rd child I never had. So we'll get started and tell you a bit about the family and how I found it. Again, I was at home getting bored, and I was on Facebook. That's what you do when you're bored in your home. You go on Facebook. And I was reading an article about the journals that popped up one day. It was written by a Washington Post author who had gone to the sesquicentennial exhibit put forward by the Library of Congress, and they said that this was one of their crowning pieces of Civil War era of writing. They had all kinds of things there. They had the contents of Abraham Lincoln's pockets when he was assassinated, all sorts of primary documents, but this one really struck the author, and he gave a really good overview of it. He said at one point, here's a young man who has a leg injury. We don't know how that happened, but he's got a leg injury, and then he gets sick and he's got bed sores. But he's really bright, and they go into a lot of the detail. What struck me as a teacher and somebody who likes to use primary sources in the classroom is the fact that it was by a young man. Somebody who was 12, he begins the journal when he's 12 years old. It ends when his life ends at 17 and a half, right at the end of the war. And I thought this would be something that would really engross students. And so I thought, well, I'm going to, see if Ted's heard about it. He'd never heard of it. He contacted other people in publishing, other people in academia. They'd never heard of Laroy either. And he says, let's go for it. So within 1 year, I had gotten the transcriptions done. I had done the genealogy for the family. We'd done all the footnotes, and it was published, and we were presenting it in his home, which is still standing. Laroy was born in 1847 into a prominent slaveholding family in Macon, Georgia. His father had trained as a lawyer, but he didn't care for the practice of law. He became the president of the Macon Manufacturing Company, which ended up becoming the largest cotton mill in Macon. He had been elected mayor twice. They elected their mayors every year. When I tell Georgia audiences that they elected governor every other year, they go, no, not that, because they went through a really bad election this last time around, but they did. You can still find a lot about the Gresham family. His father, John Gresham, after the war, after his middle son's passing, was very involved in free education for everybody, in all children in Macon. They even named a high school after him, after he passed. So it's a name that's well known. Laroy kept a diary from 1860 when he was 12. And I'll tell you why he did that, why he started it. And again, it ended when he was 17 in June of 1865. And what's unique, one of the several things about this diary that's unique, is he wrote almost every single day. There's only a handful of days where he didn't write at least something. And that's what gives you the continuity of life in this time period. You can see how Macon went from a railroad crossroads to being an important town where they had an arsenal, an armory, a ballistics laboratory, a training camp, where continually they were bringing soldiers in to train them. They had an officers' prisoner of war camp. That's what they turned their fairgrounds into. The one time where they were attacked was in the middle of 1864. It was Stoneman's raid. Stoneman got captured, but he was trying to get to Andersonville, which is where enlisted prisoners were. So it was an important place. Laroy was an invalid, and he was very sickly, but he was also, as my co-author for the curriculum guide we put together, she's from New Hampshire, so she says he's wicked smart. He was educated, kind, curious, and highly opinionated. These are his parents. They're later pictures. You can tell by Mary's clothing that this is way after the Civil War. It's probably shortly before she passed. And it's on the front porch of their house. I've sat in that exact same place. It's at 353 College Street in Macon, and it's called the 1842 Inn. It's a lovely bed and breakfast, and the people who work there have worked there for decades. And they love it when people come in and visit and say they just want to see where Laroy grew up. When you walk in the front door, when I first walked in there, I thought, this is the oddest feeling, because I felt I knew the home, but I'd never been there before. But it's really interesting to still have that there. Gresham owned about 100 slaves on 2 plantations. They're located south and east of Macon, which is kind of in the middle of the state, south of Atlanta, in what I soon learned was not Houston County, but Houston County. I contacted the map library at the University of Georgia and asked the 2 ladies who worked there to help me out. And I said, I need to get some records on Houston County. And they laughed and they go, you're not from here, are you? No, it's Houston. They were called Oakwood and Pineland. And we have found out that the area where these locations, and they're side by side, we found maps that showed where the taxation districts were. They're not developed. They're just there. And Ted is hoping to, at some point, get an archaeological team in there, because part of it also is on water, so there may be artifacts and all sorts of information about the plantation and plantation life there. That's something that it's on our wish list to do. So it was about a 1-day drive with a wagon, and they go back and forth, and Laroy tells you when they go down, when they come back up, what kinds of things they took down, what kinds of, who came up from the plantations. You get to know several of the people who worked for this family, who were slaves. This next picture is one of the things that came later. Some of the people who are related to the Greshams, this is a family who is descendants of his older brother Edmund, have shared these images with us. And this is one that, again, my Facebook friends were really, really helpful with. This is a picture taken in the late 1840s. The woman on the left is Mary Baxter, about the time when Laroy was born. So I had my Facebook friends, I put the picture on there as a closed group for women who do a lot of work on historically accurate clothing. Put it up there and said, what can you tell me about this picture? And within minutes, they told me. It's the late 1840s. And I said, how do you know? They described the aspects of the clothing that peg it at that area. I'm also friends with Ron Coddington, who is the editor for Military Images, and said, Ron, what can you tell me about this picture? This is late 1840s. I said, how do you know? And so he told me the history of that type of photography. There were 2 other women here on the other side, but the image was damaged. It's only about this big. It was hand-colored, and it had gotten wet at some point, and so we cannot see who those 2 other women are. But we believe the woman sitting next to her was her mother, Mary Ann Baxter, who lived in Athens and was the only grandparent who was alive for the Gresham children during the Civil War. Was grandmother or grandma. Laroy was pretty much a favored child in a very close family. You don't see a lot of sibling rivalry between the 3 children that the Greshams had. You see a lot of support and pride between him and his older brother and his younger sister. And these are, again, our images that we got from Edmund's descendants. And I've been looking for this picture of Thomas for a long time. Laroy describes it. It was taken in January of 1864. Thomas was the eldest, the firstborn child. He and Laroy had a very close relationship. When Thomas went off to college in Milledgeville, which was the capital of Georgia during the war, Laroy was absolutely miserable. These were 2 kids that had a language of 3 years apart. It's not uncommon for twins to have a common language that only they understand. These boys were 3 years apart, and they did the same thing. So the parents couldn't understand sometimes what they were saying. They're just talking between themselves. That's how close they were. Minnie was the only daughter. She was also highly educated. He describes some of the high points of her education. She was asked to read out loud in public in an auditorium her junior paper, which for a young lady was the only time in their life when they're the young college age, and actually it was more like a prep school. She was in her mid-teens at that point. To read in public something that you've written was the only time they could show their academic prowess. After they were done being college girls, it's back onto the more traditional. She was sent after the war to university in Baltimore, which is where she married found her husband. That's where she settled. They had 2 other siblings who died very young. Edmund, who only lived 7 months. He was the namesake of John's older brother, and we have a letter that states that Edmund had pneumonia. That's what killed him. Edward was born after Laroy. He lived 17 months. We still have a whole lot of letters we haven't been able to go through. Some people have sent some to Ted. He's holding on to them until I get a chance to look at them, but we don't know what happened with Edward. We do know that a few months ago, somebody at Rose Hill Cemetery, it's a historic cemetery in Macon, broke Edmund's headstone. And there's a gentleman who does renovations in cemeteries. He put together a community effort, and they've cleaned the gravestones and put back Edmund's gravestone, totally fixed it. So hopefully they'll be able to do that with a lot more of the gravestones at Rose Hill. But why the diary? That's the whole focus. I was able to find out how Laroy crushed his leg. A gentleman who later in life was a judge was writing his own memoirs, and he wrote that in 1856 the boys in Mr. Bates' school had decided that they were going to go down and see a building that had been burned out. It's the Washington building. It's rebuilt. You can see it in downtown Macon. And he wrote that they were climbing around in this very unstable structure. You know, boys being boys, they're going to go and investigate. And the judge noticed that the chimney, the brick chimney, which is the only thing that was really left, started wobbling. And he told all the kids to run. And everybody got out except Laroy. And it smashed his left leg. and that's the initial injury when he was 8 years old. In the diaries, he writes about being pulled in a wagon. Wheelchairs were kind of a byproduct of the Civil War. There weren't really anything like that beforehand that would have been accessible. And he was pulled by either a slave named Allen that they brought up from the plantation. He was about his age. His friends would pull him around, or his brother would pull him around town. So that's how he would get around. He develops a cough in 1857. Some of the other letters that are in the Library of Congress collection, his father talks about Laroy coughing all night. We heard him all night long. A year after that, he developed what John Gresham in another letter described as back abscesses. They were not bed sores, but they were abscesses. So I'm thinking, what is this? And in June of 1860, he traveled to Philadelphia with his father to see Dr. Joseph Pancoast. I researched Dr. Pancoast, and he was one of the first surgeons in the United States to do what we today call plastic surgery. Our theory is that Laroy had gotten very sick. He had these wounds that were nasty, they're abscesses, and they wanted Dr. Pancoast to close them. And he said no, there wasn't anything they could do for him. So they gave him some more medicine, told him to go home, and he needed to lay down. Laroy was never told what his injury was, what his illness was. So he's going through life writing about this and never knew quite what was wrong. He felt that Dr. Pancoast could cure him and always held out hope for that. But before he left, his mother gave him a diary. This is when you open it up, it's a small pocket-sized diary. So he's 12 years old, and he writes in there like a 12-year-old, short, choppy sentences. We saw flying fish. Not all the ladies on the boat were sick. They go to Philadelphia, and his father takes him to see the Natural History Museum, a few other places, and he said the Natural History Museum had all kinds of skulls. What 12-year-old boy is not going to like that? And then Ted and I had a little bit of a disagreement because I thought it was real important to write about the Japanese people that he saw in New York. And Ted's like, why do we have to put that in the footnotes? We've only have so much room. And I said, because Ted, those are the first Japanese to ever go to the East Coast of the United States. And Laroy saw them. He goes, okay, we can keep that one. So I won that one. Didn't win them all, but I won that one. So he's got some interesting observations. And again, the footnotes that I put in there were to give you some background on things like that. There's people that he comes across, I'll talk about in a little bit, that are also interesting and I think are important to know. His personality, again, he was highly educated. This is a 13, 14-year-old boy who's reading Les Miserables and enjoying it. He likes Shakespeare. He plays around with words in Latin. I had a friend who helped me with Latin, one of my former Latin teachers at my school. She goes, I don't get this one. And I said, does it help to know that he plays with words in English? She goes, yeah, now it makes sense. So he was extremely bright. He read everything he could get his hands on. And people will come up to the house and bring things for Laroy to read. He talks about that on a regular basis. He read very, very quickly. He liked mathematics. And there's some math problems I put in there. Just to show you what kind of math he was doing. He also used to he and his brother would send math problems across town to a young man who was eventually a major in the Confederate Army, had been wounded, came home. But they would send math problems to each other across town because no one else could work at quite that level. And when Jim Campbell went into the Army and Laroy went off to college, Laroy says, my career as a mathematician is over. That's it. He loved chess. He played chess with anybody he could get to sit down and play chess with him, including a lady who lived literally around the corner. Mrs. Widow liked to give parties. She gave parties to everybody. She especially liked to give parties to the young people, like Laroy's younger sister, so they would know how to properly behave in social situations. So she enjoyed doing that. And she was also a very accomplished chess player in her own right. and Laroy and two other boys, both named Bob, would go and play chess with Mrs. Whittle, and she'd beat all three of them at the same time. And he goes, I went and I played, and I really enjoyed it. His goal was to make Mrs. Whittle work at beating him. So, and he likes science, especially astronomy. He talks about comets, identifies some that now we know the names of. He has, on a couple occasions, clips that he glued into the front cover of one of his diaries about the different comets that were expected throughout the coming year, so he could keep track of that. He's inquisitive, talkative, sweet, funny, and he's kind. He doesn't have sibling rivalry, like I said. He doesn't talk badly about people around him in his everyday life. Political people, generals, it's a little different, but the people he comes in contact with regularly, he doesn't really talk badly about. He loves pets. He has a whole series of dogs named after Confederate generals. They had a cat that was very, very well loved in the family. He seemed to have a good relationship with everyone, especially one of the house slaves, a gentleman named Howard, who seemed to take on a lot of the decision making in the household. He taught Laroy how to plant cantaloupe, which was his favorite fruit. He would go out and watch him, and you can kind of see him following around, asking a ton of questions about what he's doing. He's opinionated. He has pretty much opinions about everything, including Thomas's photo. He said that was an utter disaster. And we're trying to figure out why. He didn't seem to look like a bad-looking young man, but I think it was because Thomas was the kind of kid who would go out and shoot robins with a bow and arrow. They went to Athens to visit grandmother in 1861, and Thomas was up on the roof at grandmother's house pouring pebbles down the drain spouts, doing all kinds of things like that. And here's a serious young man in 1864 who's almost 20 years old, and he is going off to war, and he knows what he's looking at. He's very serious. It's not the fun-loving Thomas he was used to. The entries include some Mark Twain-like witty phrases. At one point, he talks about one of the medications. He's very good about giving you all the details on what's going wrong with him, what kind of medications he gives. One name is really long, the medications, and he goes, and it stinks. But it's got a name that can kill anything, so he's kind of hopeful it'll work. This was one example here. It's Friday, January 24th, 1862, and you see the squiggle up and down lines? Written above it says, some jackass got hold of this book and tried his hand at writing. The only person it really could be, well, there's two people. One is Florence, the daughter of one of the house slaves, Julia Ann, and she was born on the same day Leroy's leg was smashed. It was a very busy day in that household. Leroy's father wrote a letter that morning he mailed to Mary, who was at her mother's house in Athens, saying that he wanted her to come home. He was going to pick her up because he wanted her to finish the rest of her confinement at home with him in Macon. What does that mean? She's pregnant. She never had that baby. So we know she was expecting, but something happened. Could have been the stress of having a son who's severely injured. But that one, it was either Florence, or it could be his cousin, Tracy, who was the son of one of Mary's brothers, John Springs Baxter, who was a surgeon in the Georgia Army. He went off to war, leaving his son behind with his late wife's family, living in the largest house in Macon. But his wife passed away before Tracy turned a year old. So we see how this little boy was brought up by extended family. He'd go off and visit grandmother. He would come up to the Gresham home all the time. So you get to see how children in that situation were taken in by the greater family and raised. The social life. The diary provides a really unique view into what everyday life was like. It talks about what people wore, what they dressed in, especially when things start getting tough. You know, it's hard to get the silks that the women wanted. So when Minnie wears her first palmetto hat that she made herself, that's quite an accomplishment. When they all start wearing homespun, that's also a big deal. To have one of the wealthiest families in town wearing homespun, that means it's okay for everybody to wear homespun. Some of the conversations in the home, the other interactions, streams of visitors are interesting as well. John Gresham is a elder in the Presbyterian Church. He was one of the gentlemen who put a lot of money into First Presbyterian, which again is still in Macon. And every couple years they would have the annual presbytery would be in Macon. And one year you had a man named Reverend Wilson come to the home. This is where another one I won with my publisher. It was Woodrow Wilson's father, was a guest, frequent guest in the home, as well as Reverend Axon, who was Woodrow Wilson's first wife's grandfather. When the two married, it was his father and her grandfather that married the two of them in Savannah. And Ted goes, why is that important? I said, because this family is influential and will be in the future. Okay? Woodrow Wilson is a small boy at this point, but his family is going to be influential. So they're going to have good ties in the future as well. All sorts of people come through this house, which are interesting. So you follow them from the peak of their influence to where Laroy goes, oh, I forgot to write in my journal that Father got a new buggy a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of like an oversight, to the end where his father's trying to get him a nutritious meal. He's sick. He's very sick. His father wants him to have a good meal. He buys steak for him, and he uses family silver to do it. Money's worthless. So they're trying to use their what they do have to make it through. We also included a list of the biographies of the major people in Leroy's life. When he wrote about Cousin Eliza, he knew which one of the 50-something women in the family tree named Elizabeth or Eliza he was talking about. I needed to figure that out. I have on the Ancestry.com family tree for the family exactly 1,700 people. My own family isn't that big on Ancestry. There's only 3 young men that I could not place in the family tree. They're the 3 Knox brothers that appear at the end. One of them is killed at the Battle of Franklin. They're all from Alabama, and they're cousins of John Gresham's. I just can't figure out where Knox fits in the family tree because there's no one else by that name. But it gives you a sense of who these people were and how they related into his life. Politics, this is one place where he has very strong opinions. He starts following, at the very beginning, secession and the politics of secession and of the war starting. He loves Jefferson Davis. He thinks that the Davis-Stevens ticket is what he calls a prime ticket. He is not a fan of Joe Brown. He calls him a dictator at one point. And when he's elected to his 4th consecutive term as governor, he says it's an embarrassment. He just doesn't like Joe Brown at all. So you get those pieces of information. You can see how he talks about Davis and Brown and the way they didn't get along. And Davis would say, okay, we're going to have a day of Thanksgiving. And Governor Brown would say, in Georgia, it's going to be the following week. So they didn't get along very well. He mocks Lincoln and Northern soldiers, it's very common. Have you ever seen any of Dr. Seuss's World War II political cartoons? They're brutal. This is not green eggs and ham. I shared them with my 12th graders, and they're like, whoa, Miss Croon, this is awful. It's every stereotype in the book. Okay? Laroy talks about the first skirmish that happened at Fairfax Courthouse in June of 1861. And he says something to the effect of, he knows how Lincoln is going to he's going to get his army. He's going to close all the taverns. and give the guns to the drunks and set them loose on the women and children of Fairfax Courthouse. Of course, that's not how it went, but that's the kind of thing that comes back, and he partakes in some of that. He follows the war very closely, including some of the smaller battles. And he records everything chronologically. It's another one of the things that for teaching students is of value, because they think the only thing that happens is Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. And we know that the war was much more complicated and farly spread out than that. He follows the Navy, he follows blockade runners, the Trans-Mississippi, Army of the Tennessee, and also the Army of Northern Virginia. Joe Johnston is one of his favorites. The footnotes help readers follow it, so you don't have to know all kinds of detail about the Civil War because Laroy tells you. The footnotes also help with some corrections. Again, I live in Northern Virginia. I know where the Battle of Ball's Bluff was. He calls it the Battle of Leesburg. If you look up Battle of Leesburg, you probably won't find it. So in that footnote, put in the information about it and also why it was significant. He gets news from his father, from newspapers, magazines, other adults, letters from his several uncles and cousins who are away at the war. Gives you information on that as well. He's interested in what the Georgia troops are doing, especially the ones who have come through Macon and trained there. You can see mood swings in him as things go well. Vicksburg is very up and down, up and down. And he follows Sherman and the Georgia campaign extremely well. Some of his relatives are caught up in that. Cousin Ginny is about 7 months pregnant. Her husband's off at war, and everything was gone. She had to make her way back to Macon on her own. So you get those kinds of stories as well. Processing the news was one of the things that we found was kind of interesting, because in the books we normally read about the war, it's about the battles or the personalities or the strategies. Very little about the home front and not much about the information that gets sent back. So we know what happened at Gettysburg. These people didn't. Laroy quickly learns that not everything he reads isn't true. His hopes get really high and are often dashed. I had a friend who read through the book when it first came out, and she goes, "Why is it when these battles happen, all these Federals are killed, but hardly any Confederates?" And I said, fake news, not a new concept. So, and he learns to question, and at the end you can see him saying, "I'm going to wait for the official order, to come out. I'm going to wait for something else." The clipping that I have there's a few newspaper clippings that he left in his diaries. This one is from a New York Times Herald article. So sometimes they would even print Northern news. They were so desperate to get any information that they would use the enemy's news. He's also got access to Mr. Clisby, who is the publisher of the local newspaper, and you can see how they process slow and incorrect news. When Mr. Clisby comes to the home on July 7th of 1863, and Leroy knows that Lee has gone with his army above the Potomac again, he wants to know, has anything happened? And he writes, Mr. Clisby told him that there was a small skirmish. Mr. Clisby thinks it was not a large affair. This is on July 7th of 1863. There's a little battle at a place called Gettysburg. The next few pages are nothing but trying to sort out who was really killed, who was just injured, what really happened on those days, trying to sort that information out. The issue of slavery is one that comes up very briefly. The Greshams had 93 slaves on their plantations, according to the 1860 census. The only information you have on that is the person's gender, age, degree of color. That's it. No names. There's 8 in the Macon household, but we know who they are. Laroy mentions many of them by name. He'll tell you about some of the specialties. Like Frank comes up, and Frank's a skilled carpenter, and he'll fix things. He made different pieces of furniture for Laroy for his special needs because he could not sit up with his leg injury, especially when his back really starts turning bad. He needs extra help, and Frank did a lot of that for him. Julia Ann, you can see the time and care he put in writing her name. She was one of the housemaids and did a lot of sewing for the family. He describes how the plantation crops supported the family home, as well as various slave responsibilities. At one point, one of the maids is sent back down to the plantation very quickly, and Leroy's not sure why. It happened in the middle of the night, only to find out that her sister, who's down in Houston County, was dying, and the family wanted to make sure that she could see her sister before she passed. This is John Springs Baxter, the one uncle. So it's important to remember Leroy's born into his life. He doesn't really know anything else. He only makes a few comments towards the end of his life about the institution, saying that he agrees with his father that emancipation should probably be gradual, and that was basically all he really had to say about it. He did use a few words that are a little, I've kicked kids out of my classroom from using, but he uses them as a descriptor, not so much as a pejorative. He's using the word that was used at the time period to describe a group of people. So it's not anything he goes into in a lot of detail. Can anybody read what's on that little script there? Saw off my leg. He writes that a lot. He'll just be writing along and he'll go, saw off my leg. And some people have asked me why they didn't. Probably because he didn't end up having any kind of infection, no gangrene, and doing an amputation of the leg would have been extremely dangerous without those other components with it. So they probably just left it. He was terminally ill. Again, he was never told. He didn't have the common symptoms of tuberculosis, which, if you're reading a novel, somebody coughs discreetly into a white handkerchief, and what do they have? Blood. He never has that symptom. And he tells you about all of his symptoms. He tells you what it was like to have his back lanced. For pain control, he got to have some wine before. That was it. I did not know this, but about 70% of people in this time period carried tuberculosis in their bodies. But they were normally healthy. So it never activated, it never became a problem, they were able to suppress it. His version of the disease, I didn't even know this existed, so I'm doing all this transcription, trying to figure out what's wrong. Ted and I would occasionally get on the phone and have you figured out what's wrong with him? I said, no, I can't. He's got some symptoms that sound like asthma, because he had night coughing. My daughter did that, 4 o'clock in the morning. She was going to have problems, that's when she's going to cough, 4 o'clock. But what Ted did is he contacted one of his other authors, Dr. Dennis Rosbach, who wrote a book about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in Petersburg. And he's a surgeon, he's up in Michigan. And I pulled out from our digital document all the references to his medical conditions, labeled it Leroy's medical records, and we sent it off to Dr. Rosbach. He came back 2 weeks later and says, I have a diagnosis. And it was called Pott's disease, or spinal tuberculosis. And I talk about this book like everybody, people in Starbucks, talked about it with my own physicians, and one of them is from Pakistan. He says, oh, I know all about Pott's disease. It's very common where I come from. I said, really? I've never heard of it. He says, no, you've got TB under control here. He says, but there it emerges in people who are very poor, can't get to a doctor. They live in remote villages and they can't get out to get to a doctor, or they wait too long. He says, but it's it's a particular kind of hump in their back. It's not like hunchback in the shoulders, but lower down. But he wrote about all of this in great detail, but not being a medical person, I had no way of knowing this. So it wasn't until the very end that we figured out what was actually killing this young man. We also found out from Dr. Rosbach that this is the only detailed account of tuberculosis written by a patient in the 19th century. And what's important about it is the fact he doesn't know what he has. 2 months before he dies, he's talking about what is he going to do with the rest of his life. He wants to know, I can't go to college like my brother. I've got to do something. I must be productive. He's 17. That's a time when young people start to think about their futures. And as a reader, it's devastating because he doesn't have one. So that was very difficult. And his parents knew he didn't have one. And as a parent, I can kind of see why they wouldn't tell him. Not break his spirit. That's kind of, again, those are drawings from Pott's book about TB, and that's pretty much where the decline would happen in the back. It would just eat away the vertebrae. So when he starts talking about how, my left leg has been bad for years, my right leg is starting to become useless, pretty soon I'm not going to have a leg to stand on. This kid's got a sense of humor even with all this pain. He's going through all that physical pain, but he's also watching the world in front of him outside his window collapsing at the same time. The parallel is remarkable. 1865 arrives, and he starts to take more and more morphine. He gets weaker, and the pain he describes is horrendous. You really feel for the kid. He talks about how many grains of morphine, and it's increasing and increasing. And I asked Dr. Rosbach, I said, I've got some students, they go out at lunch when they're not supposed to, and they might have one of those funny cigarettes. And they come back to the classroom after lunch, and I can't do a thing with them. How could he, taking all this high-powered opiate medication, and we've got this opiate crisis in the country right now, how could he function so well, write so beautifully, and be coherent? He goes, it's simple. He had a legitimate pain need. And the way that medication works is it goes to the part of the brain that controls pain and does what it needs to do, so the rest of his brain functions normally. Your kids have no legitimate pain need. That's why they're useless. I said, okay, that makes sense to me now. But he grew increasingly concerned about the good leg. That he didn't anticipate. And when you look at the spine and how it's bending in on itself, you can see how he would start to really lose his ability to control the leg. He also isn't walking, so there's going to be muscle atrophy at the same time. He was weighed in 1864, and he weighed 64 pounds. Okay, that's small even for that time period. So journaling, though, took his mind off his disease. He liked the writing. It sounds like he had the book with him all the time, which is why I think it was little Tracy who scribbled in it. So the final hours in his death, I noticed as I was transcribing, and I'm not using the originals. They're not even in the collection at the Library of Congress. They're in special storage. They had digitized everything, which was good because sometimes I needed to enlarge, play with the contrast. But I noticed the handwriting began to change. It was more difficult to read, and the pen skipped on the paper, so the ink didn't embed completely, especially on the very last in the diary, which was perplexing, because on June 8th, 1865, you could very clearly read the words, I am, and then something. The pen, again, didn't embed in the paper. And Ted had a better graphics program than I had. He was able to manipulate the contrast so he could read the nib line in the paper, the pressure that was put on the paper by the pen nib, and that's where we got the word perhaps. He's dictating to his mother about the last month. After the 23rd of May, everything that's written in the journal is in a different hand, and the written voice is different. So whatever he said after I am, perhaps, Mary wasn't able to write down. And that's where the diary stops. She did write, however, a really heart-wrenching letter to her only sister, 7 pages long. That's just one page there. You can see how, when you look at it closer, we do have that page in the book. Her handwriting, it skips on the paper a lot. It's a little more difficult to read, but she describes the whole thing. She tells her sister, I've had babies die before, and this is totally different. This was, he was singing in the house. We miss seeing the wagon outside the door. It's really hard to read through it. Have Kleenex with you. But it also talks about what happened in the 10 days between when Laroy's last word and his death, because he died on the 18th of June. Talks about what happened. You learn that the only people who ever treated the wound was his father, his mother, his grandmother if she was visiting, or his brother Thomas. That was it. Those are the only people that ever cleaned his wounds. He did have one day where he had very little pain the day before he died, and he only gets angry once. And this is a young man who reads something religious every Sunday, wants very much to be able to have communion in the church with everybody else. He's never able to do that. He gets mad once because a military band is playing music on the street and marching around. He goes, it's not appropriate for a Sabbath. And he only gets mad one time. He's not angry with God because he figures God has this all in his plan. He was very sure in his faith. He felt he was going to be going to heaven. He was angry at his mother for not telling him sooner because he wanted to be able to give away his most precious possessions in person. And he didn't have enough time. And that's kind of heartbreaking too. His gift to history is his is the only teenaged male non-combatant account of the Civil War that we know of. Okay? So Ted asked me to go looking for other diaries, find something from the era. I found a lot written by women or girls, but they were spotty. They weren't every single day. If they were written by men, they were generally somebody who was in the Army, who was writing their memoirs later. I read a lot by men who rode with Jeb Stuart or who were on the staff of Stonewall Jackson, but nobody like Laroy. It's the only insider view of a prominent Southern family during the war where you really watch how that society functioned. I kind of don't include Mary Chestnut in that, because when you're best friends with President Davis's wife, it makes you a little bit different. Although her journals are interesting on their own. Again, this is the only detailed diary in the world on the course and treatment of tuberculosis in the 19th century, written by the patient. Dr. Rosbach wrote a small companion piece called I Am Perhaps Dying. He fills it in, and he gives more detail than he does in the medical forward and afterward about tuberculosis, the kinds of treatments they had, why they would use mercury. I didn't know that it was poison. They used all kinds of things. It sounds like they're trying to just throw things on the wall and see what sticks, because they really were trying to come up with a new way of figuring out how to treat this disease. So Ted asked me once we got on the phone, he says, did you ever finish that assignment I gave you? I said, what assignment? He goes, about the diaries. I said, oh yeah. No, I haven't found anything else. I said, there's only one that I think comes close. And he goes, well, what is it? And I said, it's the diary of Anne Frank, and there's a silence on the end of the phone. He goes, you got to explain that one to me. And I said, well, there's obvious differences. Different time periods. She's writing during World War II. He's writing during the Civil War. She's hiding from a regime that's trying to kill her because of her religion. He's got a disease inside of him that's killing him. He doesn't even know it's there. I said, but they both are very extremely observant teenagers who are writing about a world that they knew that's falling apart in front of them, and all they can do is describe. They have hopes, they have aspirations that they write about, and they're not going to happen, which makes it tragic. One gentleman at a Civil War roundtable I did a year ago in Ohio said that Shakespeare could not have written a more perfect tragedy than this. And I think in a way he's right. Parallels again between Leroy and Frank are not perfect, but I think they're both the voices of their generation. And we have a lot to learn from each one of them. So again, I think I've been blessed to work on this project, and I've worked with a friend. We have a curriculum guide coming out. We've been asked to put together a young readers version for grades 5 through 8 that we're working on right now. And I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Yes. I can tell you who his first crush is, but that would spoil it. He is. There's a couple of young ladies that are sisters of his, friends of his sisters, that you can kind of tell that they're special for him. He's also like every other kid. Ted kept complaining because I kept taking clips of things that he would draw in the margins. And he goes, why are you putting those in there? And I said, because they're like every kid in 9th grade that I've had, where they're doodling their names, practicing writing their names in different ways. That's a commonality. He's a kid. Just like any other kid. It's just, his time period is different. I taught international baccalaureate kids. They're extremely bright. They almost all went on to college. The ones who didn't had other plans that they were able to follow. And I could see him fitting in with those kids. His intellect, when he's about 14, 15 years old, is off the charts. The markers we use as teachers to measure kids' abilities, he's just incredible. Would have loved to have him in the classroom. But yeah, there's young ladies that he... Yes?
2 quick questions.
Sure.
Did he receive any tutoring or schooling while in the house?
Not that he mentions. He talks about Mr. Bates coming over, who was a school teacher, and literally the school was across the street. He could see his friends playing, like at recess, outside from his front yard. But he couldn't go over there, and that was another thing. Why can't he go to church? Why can't he go to school? When his sister recites her junior essay, why is he sitting outside the building? Well, when we find out he's got TB, then it all makes sense.
Okay.
Yes.
And the second was perhaps, you're saying that 70% of the population carried trichomonas.
Right.
Was perhaps the leg injury something that weakened his body, that exacerbated tuberculosis?
That's our working theory, actually, is that the leg injury it messed with his immune system. The disease was able to progress. His father took him to see Dr. Pankos. He could afford the best doctors. Took him there to try and get him to close the wounds, and he said, no, I can't do it. The disease is what was coming out of the wounds. It's got to come out somewhere. If I close them, it's only going to be painful. It's only going to cause him more misery. I'm not going to do it. Yes.
Your work is fantastic.
Thank you.
An opinion from you. Would the story be more embraced by the public and by the media if instead of being the child of a rich slaveholder, he was the child of a Northern Union working man? Would the reception have been any different?
That's hard to say. That's hard to say. I only get, what's presented to me. I think one of the things that does make it different is that it is in the South, where people get to see that this is a human side of the South. I think it would be just as interesting if it was in the North. But you also get to see how these households function with the duality between the two, you know, the slave and the slaveholder was. They're very dependent on one another. But I think you get to see these people again as individuals with names and personalities that would be lost otherwise. I spent one evening reading I told my younger daughter, she goes, Mom, you have such an exciting life. I read the 1870 census for Bibb County, Georgia. I was looking for Howard. I mean, Howard was very important to Laroy. And I was looking for him, and I found 3 men in the census because they were putting names in for everybody, named Howard, and they were all the wrong age. So I'm going to go and read Houston County at one point and see if I can find Howard there to see what happened. So I think that would be an interesting part of the story. That's why we're excited that Warner Robins Air Force Base did not extend as far out as the plantations. That it's not been touched. The people call it Okie Woods, if you could colloquialize the name. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned in the book about his mom always being sick. Did you ever find out what was wrong with her?
No, and that's we don't know if it's stress related. She is sick quite a bit. He'll talk about mothers in bed. I don't know if she had some sort of illness because she lost babies. If it was something that was, gynecological, she would not have shared that with him. So we just don't know at this point. Hopefully in some of the letters that I haven't gotten to, that we've been gifted by Edmund's descendants, we'll be able to find something in there. Because that is a question I've had as well. What was it? She doesn't look like a very robust person in either one of those pictures. So it'll be interesting to find out. Yes?
Sherman's march to the sea shouldn't have been too far.
And people were surprised by that. He mentions that because of the armory, the arsenal, the ballistics laboratory. I've also found out recently that they made a saddlery for the cavalry there. All kinds of things were manufactured in Macon. He also didn't go to the Augusta Powder Works either. They were surprised by that.
So there's something had no first-hand observance of anything.
No, they thought they were coming at one point, and there was a feint in that direction, and Laroy had to decide whether Minnie stays or goes. His father is in the Home Guard, his brother's off, he's in Shenandoah Valley, and Leroy's the man in the household. He's got to decide what happens to his sister. I won't tell you because that would spoil it. But they're worried about that. During Stoneman's raid, he goes up on the roof. Someone must have carried him up there because it's only a really small passageway. And he watched the barrage, the artillery barrage that was from the other side of the Ocmulgee River. And there's a house in town called the Cannonball House, where the cannonball bounced in the front yard, went through the colonnade and into the house. You can go and visit it. It's really interesting. The people who work there are great too. And Laroy says they left the next day. It was Asa Holt, Judge Holt and his family. They left. But that was the only thing he was able to see. But that was with Stoneman. That was in the summer. The feint was in September.
Any more? One more?
Yes.
Did you mention Andersonville at all? Do they know what's going on there?
No. They know that they were trying to get there, but they really didn't have any idea. They had officers that they kept at Macon. They called it Camp Oglethorpe. But no real. He does mention that they had liberated the camp and that they were walking around, but he doesn't see any of that.
Janet, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here.
behalf of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee, present to you the Certificate of Honor by order of
my
the General
goodness.
Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Janet Kroon for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, you're not done yet.
Oh.
The Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, through the auspices of two sons of Union veterans, has become the custodian of the Iron Brigade Association. We are the Iron Brigade Association, which was originally founded by the veterans of the Iron Brigade. It gives me great honor to present to you a membership pin for membership in the Iron Brigade Association. Not sure how Laroy would have felt about this, but I can say I'm very pleased to present this to you, Jim.
Thank you very much. That is quite an honor. Thank you very much.
One last thing. This is a little bit more personal.
Okay.
I think we found out through our communications that we probably met each other a long time ago in a quilt store. So I wanted you to go home with something that was quilted, and to think that maybe Leroy might have had a quilt on his lap when he was sitting in his wagon
I
or
like
laying
that.
in his bed.
I like
And
that.
it's done in Civil War reproduction fabric, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm running out of hands.
Let's see the quilt, show us.
I will. Yes. I lived in the area I grew up in when my ex-husband got out of the Air Force. He worked for Commonwealth Edison for a while, and I was in a quilt guild, and we used to come up here to Trudy Hughes' quilt shop. So if you know anything about quilting and Trudy Hughes, that's probably where we met. Another store up here as well. Oh, this is gorgeous. Thank you. This is a lot of work. Thank you.
Buy some books, we don't have to take them back then.
Janet, thank you very much for your
Thank
presentation
you.
tonight. She has books available, and I suspect the author might be willing to sign it, so you can have an autographed copy.
I would.
Again, our next meeting is